Links to previous episodes are given in the video description, so don't forget to like, subscribe and share the video. Mercy of the God of War. Episode 7. A few weeks later, Karen still hadn't returned. Cassandra was growing lonely, sitting by herself in the imperial concubine's garden. No matter how many times she had been told not to worry, she couldn't help but stare at the horizon, beyond the city's high walls. She had changed over the past few weeks. Under her new guardian's insistence, she had started taking better care of herself. She was now used to wearing the beautiful red gowns and jewelry. Every morning, servants would help her dress, put a bit of pink balm on her lips, and brush her hair, suggesting a few hairpins or bracelets, until Cassandra couldn't take it anymore and ushered them out to finish her preparations alone. She had finally put on a few pounds too. How could she not have? Karine made sure she ate plenty at each meal and brought her snacks at all times of day. Cassandra had only recently found a way to stop her overbearing actions by faking some nausea. Truthfully though, she really was nauseous at times, especially in the morning. Her tummy had developed a little bump as proof of her pregnancy, making this child feel a bit more real each day. Cassandra was caressing her belly, lost in her thoughts when Karine walked in. Concubine mother. Good morning. What are you doing out so early without a shawl? Though she was asking Cassandra, her glare found a servant, who immediately ran inside to get one. But the young concubine shook her head. I am fine, really. It's much warmer here than it was at the Onyx Castle. Cassandra missed it. She wondered every day about Nebera and the others, and the military camp. How did they function without the prince there? Perhaps he had visited during these weeks and didn't stop by the Diamond Palace? So stubborn, sighed the concubine mother. She was about to add something else, but at that same moment, Sri jumped from over the balcony. The purple dragon struggled for a few seconds to come in, balancing strangely on the ledge. With his torn wing and uneven weight, the dragon never seemed particularly agile. It eventually managed to get on its feet, and walked to sit by Karine's side. Cassandra felt uneasy anytime she watched that dragon. It didn't like her and, up until now, had only interacted with her through warning growls and defiant glares. Even as the imperial concubine caressed it, it seemed restless. Good boy, said Karine. The dragon, Sri cannot fly, can it? Asked Cassandra. She had doubts as she certainly had never seen it actually use its wings and Sri never hunted either, only wandered around the palace letting servants feed him huge portions of meat. That is correct. He lost the ability, his wings are too damaged now to support his weight. The child cannot hunt. Concubine mother, is he? He was my firstborn, Swiren's, dragon. He died at 6 years old. Cassandra was struck by those revelations. 6 years old? So young. How could a prince die at such a young age? Karine, as if she had guessed her silent question, sighed. He was killed. Someone threw my child from a balcony like this one. Cassandra looked at the balcony Karine was gesturing to. It wasn't something a child could climb over by himself. How could someone be so cruel as to murder a child so brutally? My second one. She was a girl. She was killed 2 days after she was born. Someone got into my room and suffocated her with a pillow. A pillow? Cassandra felt nauseous. Who would? To a newborn. She felt sick just thinking about it. After Sherian, I was pregnant with another son. I was beyond paranoid about protecting my children, but it wasn't enough. He was poisoned at 2 years old. His dragon died instantly with him. How horrible! Cassandra wondered what Karen's childhood could have been like in such dangerous conditions. Strangely, however, Karen didn't seem affected while revealing all of this. Instead, pure anger was painted across her face. Cassandra glanced at the small dragon sitting by her feet. Kray's older sibling was so small compared to him. Who dares to? Both women glared at the incoming shadow in the sky. Cassandra instantly knew it wasn't Kray, as its tail shape was different. When he got closer, she realized it was a green dragon, one that she had seen in the arena. Anur, wondered a voice behind them. Sherian had just come out, squinting at the incoming dragon. It landed outside of the palace, but neither woman went to him. Instead, Karen went to wait in a large room by the entrance. Settling into a large wooden chair, Karen ordered Cassandra to sit next to her while Sherian stood to the side. Concubine mother. Sister Sherian. Prince Anur was the youngest of the imperial princes and barely resembled Karen. He had a nice smile and a thin build like his green dragon, which looked more like a lizard. Anur. What about your manners? Don't be mean, concubine mother. I came to give you news about my brother. Is he all right? Cassandra immediately asked, visibly worried. Anur, surprised that she dared to address him, gave her a glance of disgust. Who is that? Have you gone blind, brother, or is it that little boys can't see red? Said Sherian. Oh, is this brother's concubine? I didn't recognize her. So she is the pregnant one. Anur, enough. Where is my son, you impertinent child? Father got angry with him. He sentenced him to be hung in the dungeons for 50 days, with imperial servants whipping him 10 times every hour. How dare he? Roared Karen. Meanwhile, Cassandra was on the verge of tears. Whipped? Her prince had been detained and whipped relentlessly since then? Only Sherian didn't seem affected, stifling her laughter in the corner. Looks like father is really desperate for your attention, mother. He shall see. That old fool will pay for touching my son. Her anger echoed within the walls, and she stood up to her full height, causing Anur to shrink a little. Concubine mother, this is a bit. Silence. Don't you dare say a word to defend him. Ruin. To Cassandra's surprise, a wall of green scales appeared on the other side of the door, the imperial concubine rushing to it. She can command any of the dragons? Cassandra asked Sherian. Of course not. Only those she raised listened to her. Anur's mother was murdered when he was an infant. Our mother took care of him and Rune in her stead, as she and his mother were close. Cassandra realized Anur's mother had probably been killed in the race to the throne as well. Karen was determined as she stood before the large green dragon. Cassandra hesitated a bit before eventually following, seeing that Sherian was also accompanying her mother. It was smaller than Kray, probably because it was younger, but still quite sizable, with a leaner face, and its wings and tail had a different shape. The little dragon turned its head to Kareen, intrigued, swishing its tail left and right. "Concubine mother," called Anur. "Let's go. We shall see if that emperor dares to injure my precious son again." She was obviously dead set on flying to the imperial palace. Before the young prince could even protest, she had taken her place on the dragon's back, and Sherian was helping Cassandra on too. He sighed, and climbed up. 4 people was still nothing for the dragon, who took off right away, visibly excited. Cassandra couldn't help but feel nauseous as it was her first flight in a while and on a different beast, too. Moreover, she was concerned about Karen. It wasn't until Sherian stroked her back that she was pulled from her thoughts. "Are you okay? You're paler than usual." "I'm just worried about him." "What are you worried for?" "Our father is just using him to get mother's attention, but he won't go overboard. My brother is absolutely fine." But Cassandra couldn't be comforted, even as they landed at the imperial palace. She hadn't been back there in a while and didn't hold many good memories about it. She followed the imperial concubine and her children who hurried inside. A few imperial servants tried to stop Kareen. "Imperial concubine, you can't walk in unannounced like this. The imperial emperor is busy." "He is busy? If he is so busy he should have let my son be. How dare he abuse my child?" Her yelling had every imperial servant running away in fear. Kareen stormed through the palace with no one daring to stop her. Cassandra even witnessed several concubines turning around with terrified expressions as soon as they saw her. Shortly, they arrived at the Grand Hall's main gates. Cassandra's heart beat louder, filled with worry. "You old dragon!" roared Kareen while throwing the gates wide open. It was quite a unique sight to behold. The emperor, sitting on his golden throne, spat out his wine upon hearing her. It was the first time Cassandra was able to really take a good look at him. Previously, she had to keep her eyes down because of her slave status, but now that she was wearing a red dress and accompanied by imperial concubine Kareen, she wasn't as afraid to look. She was surprised. She had expected a much older man, maybe around 60 or 70, especially since he already had so many children. However, the man didn't look a day over 50. She was speechless. How could that be? He had children older than Karen. Kareen. Seeing him stuttering like that, he looked like a teenager caught doing something wrong. At his feet, a handful of young women, who were holding plates of fruits or instruments, went completely white at the sight of the imperial concubine. They all stood up and retreated, as if some dangerous beast had come into the room. Cassandra, however, had her eyes set behind them. "Cray!" The black dragon had already turned to her, growling and struggling to come closer. Despite the attempts, Cray was unable to budge, a much larger beast actually trapping it on the ground, the imperial golden dragon, Clahad. Cassandra was shocked. Cray was big, very big, but Clahad was massive. The golden dragon was the size of a large building and covered in gold scales. Its ruby eyes were the most beautiful thing she had ever seen and also the most terrifying. She was used to Cray, and had learned not to fear the black dragon, but Clahad was another level of scary. It was a mythical creature, a god who could decide between life and death in a single bite. When it turned its head towards them, she couldn't help but stumble a few steps back. "Kareen! You're back, my dearest," exclaimed the emperor, visibly overjoyed. He didn't even seem to see his concubine's angry face as he stood up, smiling wide from ear to ear. "You should have told me. I would have gathered a few presents, or ordered a celebration." "A celebration? A celebration for what? How you're abusing my dearest son." "You cold-hearted, selfish old man." As she kept yelling, Claude, from his perch upon Cray, abruptly spotted her. The dragon's eyes immediately changed, opening wide while staring. Sherian grabbed Cassandra's arm and had her step even further back, her eyes fixed on her father's dragon. The next second, Claude jumped, almost running to Kareen with a long growl. Though it was scary to see a dragon of this size run at them, Cassandra immediately recognized the behavior. It was the same impulsive affection Cray often displayed towards her. The golden dragon ran until Kareen suddenly turned her head towards it, glaring fiercely. "Don't you dare, you rascal!" Instantly, Claude dug its paws and claws into the perfect wooden floors, grinding to a halt a few meters away from Kareen. The dragon was frozen in an awkward pose, with its body turned towards her, but its collar and head turned away, like a guilty dog. It kept trying to sneak glances at her, but had to turn its red gaze away every time, as the concubine was glaring. Behind Claude, Cray furtively took this opportunity to throttle towards Cassandra, wrapping its body around the concubine as she scratched and caressed its head, happy to reunite with her prince's dragon. Meanwhile, Claude softly growled, jealous, but Kareen had already turned back to the emperor. "Where is my son?" The emperor looked baffled, surprised even. He clearly wasn't expecting his concubine's anger and stared at her with a confused expression. "Kareen, dearest, answer me." Cassandra couldn't help but think about how exceptionally bold Kareen was. Was she some goddess reincarnated? To be talking to the emperor like this, you needed to have a few extra lives. The man sighed. "Kareen, don't be like this. You know I don't want to be mean, But how else could I get your attention? And see. Even mad, you're so pretty." "Oh, you want to see me mad? Come closer and I'll yank your hair out. Now, give me my son back, you deceitful snake." "I get it, dearest, but please stop screaming, you'll hurt your pretty little voice. If we want to be able to have a nice chat later, we should." "A nice chat? You force me to come all the way here to retrieve my son and you expect me to sit down and idly chat with you? How dare you? Oh, come now, I'll have your favorite garden prepared. How about that? With your favorite tea, too. Do you want a massage? I have a young lady who can do wonders." "Ha! Now you want to brag about your new concubines to me? That's just a bit too much. You think I'll die of jealousy? Hey!" Meanwhile to the side, Cray was happily growling and rubbing against Cassandra's hands, and sending glances towards Kareen too, gently pushing her with its snout. Claude, however, was still sitting a few steps away from the imperial concubine mother and was glaring at it with jealousy. The imperial golden dragon growled several times, but Cray ignored it, too absorbed by Cassandra. When Glahad had finally had enough, it reached out a paw, aiming its claws at Cray's rear, but the black dragon growled back. The two started bickering, making an awful lot of noise in the room, and no matter how angry Karine and the Emperor were, two adults yelling couldn't possibly be heard over the ruckus. That's when the Emperor, suddenly taking on a very annoyed expression, turned to them. Enough! Both dragons froze, but Cray was still childishly growling, curling its body around Karine and Cassandra with a defiant look. Glahad walked back behind the throne with a sullen expression, but stayed silent. The Emperor sighed, turning to Sherian. "My daughter, go get your brother before your mother really gets angry at me." One could have argued the imperial concubine was already angry enough, but Sherian simply left the room, Cassandra following closely behind her. The princess seemed to know exactly where to go, heading down several staircases and crossing corridors in record time. They arrived at the dungeons a short while later. It was cold and sinister down there. Sherian gave some orders to the imperial servants and they guided her to a large cell. "My lord," yelled Cassandra. As soon as the door was opened, she ran inside. Karen was there, hanging by his wrists from the ceiling. He seemed unconscious, but Cassandra was more worried about the number of dark scale lines on his skin. How many times had he been whipped? She started crying while Sherian looked on, dumbfounded. "What is wrong with you? Stop crying, he's fine." "Fine? How was he fine?" But Sherian rolled her eyes and walked over, taking her own whip out. Before Cassandra could react, Sherian violently slashed her brother's arm. A few seconds later, the red mark was already covered in black scales. "What are you doing? He's already unconscious from." "What? Unconscious?" retorted Sherian, satirically. "He is asleep." "Asleep?" Cassandra stepped closer to Karen. His eyes were closed, he was breathing slowly and almost snoring. Snoring? How could he be sleeping in these conditions? His sister rolled her eyes again and slapped his biceps a few times. "Karen, wake up, your precious woman is here crying because of you." It took a few seconds, but the prince finally opened his eyes to Cassandra's relief. He frowned, surprised to see her there. "Cassandra! My lord! My lord, are you all right? Does it hurt?" "Stop with the pity party, you two, it's annoying," said Sherian. "And you, brother, what were you thinking? Why would you let yourself be whipped?" Karen was focused on Cassandra, ignoring his sister. Seeing her tears flowing, he became angry and confused. "Cassandra, why are you crying? Who did this to you?" He struggled a bit with the shackles holding him, and then all of a sudden, they snapped with a loud metallic crack, shocking her. Freed, the prince landed on his feet in front of her, immediately brushing his hands on her cheeks. You could free yourself?" asked Cassandra in surprise. "Of course. You think those shackles could restrain a dragon master?" sighed Sherian. "So silly. Anyway, I'll be on my way now." His sister left the cell and headed back into the imperial palace, but neither of them paid her any attention. Cassandra was still speechless, looking at him confused, while Karen caressed her cheeks, trying to understand the cause of her tears. "Are you injured? Who made you cry?" he kept asking unrelentingly. All of a sudden, Cassandra pushed his hands away, angry. "I was worried about you. I thought you were actually hurt. And I was waiting and worried. How could you stay here when you could have just freed yourself?" All she could think about was how the imperial family was too much. Who lets themselves be whipped and trapped without complaint? And not even try to get free for weeks. How could Karen be so heartless and not even think of her feelings? Cassandra turned her back to him, both angry and embarrassed. His Highness had gone too far. Cassandra. Seeing her enraged was a first for Karen. He was now feeling a bit guilty and had no idea how to make up for it. He put his arms around her, resting his hands on her little baby bump. "Sorry. Father really wanted to see Mother." Cassandra turned around, scowling. "Don't tell me. All of this was only to have the concubine Mother come here." Karen nodded. "It was the only way my father could think of to compel her to come." "Why did you agree to it?" "Because he said if I helped him, he would agree to my demands." "Come." Worried about her staying too long in the cold dungeons, Karen gently ushered Cassandra out and guided her back into the castle. They walked for a few minutes, until they reached what looked like a little reading nook or tea salon, with two women in red dresses inside. "Get out," growled Karen. They left in a hurry, keeping their eyes on the floor. The prince then gently guided Cassandra to sit in the middle of a little pile of brightly colored cushions. Taking to his knees in front of her, he grabbed her hands and started tenderly kissing them. Frowning a bit, Cassandra pushed him away. "I'm still upset, my lord. How could you have agreed to that? I was worried for weeks." But Karen only smirked, caressing her hair. "Did you miss me? It's not funny." Cassandra pouted, throwing one of the little cushions at him. "I was really worried." "I get it, I'm sorry. I apologize." Cassandra looked away from him, her cheeks flushed from a mix of anger and attempts to repress her tears of relief. She didn't want to forgive him so soon for abandoning her for weeks. Weeks. He had simply stayed here without warning her, and not thinking about her feelings at all. "Cassandra. I'm sorry." Karen softly kissed her skin, leaving a trail of kisses from her wrist, up her arm, and finally landing on her shoulder. Cassandra shivered. A wave of warmth overcame her, along with her prince's familiar smell. "My lord." "Karen," he corrected. She shook her head, biting her lip and trying to breathe. His hand was slowly caressing her leg, pushing the fabric of her red dress higher above her knee. Cassandra was blushing as she thought about the last time they'd had this kind of contact, how it had been far too long. Karen's lips were now on her chest, on that little spot of skin her dress wasn't covering. She grabbed his shoulder, feeling the sensation of his hot skin under her fingers. The black scales that tracked over his body were rougher, but she liked their unusual texture. Karen shifted her back, having her lay in the middle of the cushions. He reached for her hairpins, taking each of them out and freeing her long curls. He brushed his fingers through, caressing each strand, before firmly grabbing a handful of her luscious locks. Meanwhile, his other hand was sliding down along her waist to her thigh, playing with the inner layers of her dress. Cassandra was already too flustered to breathe steadily. The blood under her skin was sizzling, flushing it to an excited pink. She grabbed his face in her hands, and pulled him up for a long, deep kiss. Finally allowed to kiss her, Karen didn't wait to respond fiercely, crashing his tongue and lips against hers, brushing her skin and hair with his fingers. He finally reached the last layers of her clothes, grabbing her underwear to pull down her legs. Cassandra felt it, and her senses went into overdrive, feeling them slide down until they were gone. His fingers were caressing her, heating things up between her legs, rubbing her thighs, and at her entrance. The slow motions were torture, a very sweet and exciting torture, causing a rush of adrenaline. She was moaning under the movements of his hands, unable to free her lips from his passionate kiss. Karen wouldn't let go of her, pressing his body against hers. He was ruthless with his mouth and his hands all over her. Cassandra could barely catch her breath between his lips, while his fingers ventured further, grinding against her insides and making her legs tremble. She wanted to cry out, beg for mercy, but he was barely letting her make any sound, nothing but erratic moans. How could this be appropriate? They were inside the imperial palace, anyone could barge in. But, of course, he didn't care. Karen kept going, too engrossed in their arousal and savoring the wetness on his fingers. They hadn't been together in so long. His desire was growing exponentially, as he quickly undid his belt. Cassandra was finally able to breathe when his lips plunged to her, undoing the top of her dress to caress and tease them. She gasped, feeling him pressing between her legs. "My lord!" He kissed on her skin, leaving red marks above her and all over her white skin. Cassandra's body overflowed with sensation, holding on to his shoulders, to the soft cushions around her. She continued trembling in pleasure, but she was wet and getting impatient. Her fidgety hands reached for his member, caressing it. Karen growled a bit, surprised. He let her do so though, and went back to her lips, deeply kissing her again. He wanted this woman so much. How could he have kept them apart for weeks? With a swift shift of his hips, the war god slowly penetrated her, causing his concubine to cry out in pleasure. Feeling him fill her to the brim was the hottest sensation she ever had. Cassandra took deep breaths as they slowly started moving their hips together, but Karen wasn't that patient. He accelerated, thrusting long and fast inside her, driving her crazy with his perfectly timed momentum. He kept going, in and out, breathing loudly. Cassandra felt her lower body burning, her legs and hips a slave to his wild movements. It was so good, so good. And they hadn't done it in so long. She just didn't want this to stop. Obliging her need, Karen kept going, only slowing down to change positions a couple of times. Cassandra found she was starting to really like those colored cushions. She was on her flank, his arms around her, going voraciously at it from behind. Karen kissed her shoulder, caressed her, making her go insane. His double rubbing on her most intimate parts were bringing her to the verge of explosion, but she was trying hard to hold it back. She didn't want to come first again. Cassandra tried breathing deep and hard, but her prince was relentless, not giving her a moment's respite. Suddenly, She heard him groan as he accelerated further, and she couldn't take it anymore. In a long cry of absolute bliss, she spasmed around him, unleashing. Karen joined her at the same time, in a long release. He sighed against her skin. It was high time you came. As they were putting their clothes back on, Karen couldn't help but thoroughly behold his concubine. Why did she seem prettier than he remembered? His mother's influence could be seen on her. Cassandra had always been naturally graceful and gentle-mannered, but now, she was moving with the attitude of a queen. Or maybe it was just the jewelry enhancing her natural beauty. "How is our son?" asked Karen, caressing her tummy. "He's fine. I can feel him a little now. And the egg has grown bigger, too." Karen nodded in approval and took her hand, pulling her out of the room. Cassandra was completely lost in the maze of the palace, but the prince guided her confidently. In a few minutes, they were back in the main room where the emperor's golden throne was. Sherian was still there, her arms crossed. "Karen." Karine sighed out in relief. "See, he's fine, Dar." "Fine? Then what are those?" The imperial concubine was inspecting the scaled scars on her son, looking furious. "Who dared to injure my son? I want their heads." "Fine, yes, whatever you want." "Would you move back to the palace now, please?" asked the emperor, visibly annoyed. "Move back to this nest of snakes? Among all those two-faced? The little sluts that skulk around here? You're being a bit too much, darling." "Over my dead body," yelled Karine. "And know that if anything happens to my children or grandchildren, this will be the last time you'll see me." And with that, she turned on her heels and left the room, not hiding her anger. "Karine." "Oh, that woman," sighed the emperor. He sat back on his throne looking sullen. Behind him, Claude looked a bit disappointed too, laying down with a long face. Karen walked up the first few stairs towards the throne. "Father, my request." "Your request? What request? Your mother didn't even listen. You only asked that she would come here," growled Karen. "Come and listen to me. All she did was yell at me. Did I deserve that? I feel so pathetic. She won't even look at me anymore. What good is it being the emperor if you can't even control your own women?" "Father." "Ah, enough. I've had enough yelling for one day. We'll talk about it later. Just go to your rooms, and won't you and your concubine please attend the New Year celebrations?" Karen's fists tightened. This stubborn father of his was really getting on his last nerve, but before he could add anything, Cassandra grabbed his hand gently. "Let's go," she whispered to him. He didn't say anything further, listening to her instead and stepping down, before leaving the room altogether. All that time, Cassandra hadn't glanced at the emperor once. For some reason, she felt very awkward just being in the same room as him. They kept walking in silence through the corridors, passing by several rooms. "My lord, what did you ask of your father? In exchange for all this?" "To be taken out." "Taken out? Of his possible successors?" "What?" Cassandra stopped, speechless. He had asked for what? As she had stopped walking, Karen had no choice but to stop and turn back to her. "You asked for what?" "For my father not to consider me as one of his successors. To be taken out of the running for future emperor." Why would you do that?" Cassandra asked, still in shock. "To protect you," Karen shrugged. "That is not a valid reason." He didn't even respond to that. Cassandra couldn't understand what was going on. Was it because of what she had said? How scared she was for their child's safety. Did he think everything would be solved if he was ruled out as a potential successor? Cassandra's mind was working at full speed. This was too much, even if it was for her sake. "My prince, you can't." Later. Karen started walking again, and Cassandra followed, realizing that they were headed outside of the imperial palace. As it was much warmer there, a bit too hot for her. Cassandra tried to stay in his shadow to shield herself from the sun. As soon as they reached the outer gardens, a bunch of young women suddenly approached them. They all had green dresses on and harbored fake smiles. "Your Highness! Are you going outside? Do you need help? We can accompany you, if you'd like." Cassandra was outraged by the women's smutty intentions. What was this? Didn't they usually fear the war god? And they were all blatantly ignoring her in their efforts to seduce him. Had they no shame at all? However, Karen resolutely ignored them. Maybe for the first time though, Cassandra felt utterly annoyed. Had they become servants of the imperial palace just to try and seduce one of the princes? Didn't they fear for their lives? "Your Highness! Wouldn't you like another woman to warm your bed?" Suddenly, Karen stopped and turned to the young woman who had spoken. She was pretty with shiny hair and big lustful eyes, but Karen's eyes reflected back nothing but annoyance. She didn't realize this and assumed a seductive posture, showing off her curves. Cassandra looked elsewhere as she couldn't bear to watch this kind of scheming. "Out of our way!" I said, "Get out of our way!" The woman looked a bit shocked, but kept insisting, trying to use her physical charms. But don't you think I'm pretty? And I'm very experienced, too." Before she could add anything else, Karen shoved her to the side with enough force to send her tumbling to the floor, falling flat on her. None of the other women moved to help her, they were all petrified by the prince's deathly glare. Karen resumed walking, not even bothering to look at them any longer. Cassandra followed in his steps silently. The servants didn't dare to add a word either, especially after a dark shadow suddenly flew over them. Cray landed behind Cassandra, toddling to her until its head could be by the concubine's side. The dragon's arrival had scared away all the nearby servants, but it made Cassandra smile. Cray softly growled while waddling by her side, following them outside the imperial palace's domain. The palace itself was so vast that it took quite a while to leave it. Once they walked past the large walls though, the city sprawled out in front of them. Cassandra took a deep breath. It had been so long since she had been in the city. Not much had changed over the last few months, of course, as she recognized most of the streets and shops. What was different was the way people looked at her though. This was the first time she could walk with her head held high. Before, she would get looks of disgust, people chasing her away like vermin. Now, the women were covetous of her, while the men lusted over her. All of them were careful to look down if the prince or his dragon came near, though, and Cray growled often, warning people not to come too close, forcing a clear path to open up in front of them, obviously disliking crowds. Now, those people were the ones averting their eyes and being careful. It was a vastly different experience. "Where are we going, my lord?" "To the slave market." Cassandra was speechless. "Really? Now?" But indeed, after a few more steps, she started to recognize the direction they were headed. Was he really going to take care of her slave status, now? "How do you know where it is, my lord?" "I used to run away from the palace and come to the city." "Really? Was he a mischievous child growing up?" Cassandra couldn't keep herself from smiling, imagining a young Karen playfully running through the streets. "See, Cassie!" Cassandra turned around. Hidden in the crowd, a pair of young slaves were looking at her with shocked eyes. She recognized them instantly. "Ethan? Myra?" she called out to them. They nodded, and the people around the slaves stepped back. The two were younger than Cassandra. Ethan was 14 years old, and Myra was just 11. After a brief hesitation, they walked up to her and Cassandra hugged them as soon as they were within reach. "Ethan, your hand." She looked at the bandage on his wrist, where his hand used to be. He still had it when she had left their master's house. "Ah. It's okay, Cassie, I'm fine." "They." Master was very angry at that time, so he. "Cassie, I thought you were dead." Myra interrupted, tears in her eyes. "The master said that you were given as an offering to the. She didn't finish her sentence, but her eyes were clearly on Cray, afraid. The dragon was looking at her with curiosity though. "Cassandra." "Who are they?" asked Karen. "We worked for the same master." "The old master is dead, Cassie. Now his son is our master." Cassandra felt like screaming. She remembered him. He was about her age, but the old minister's son was a horrible, spoiled child. He had laid his hands on the young female slaves several times and was even worse to the men. Ethan's hand was only a glimpse of his cruelty. She shook her head. She couldn't possibly let them go back. Cassandra turned her head to Karen, hesitating for a moment. Could she ask for a favor like this? Maybe just this once? Feeling her hesitation, her prince turned to her. "Say it." Can they come with us? Please." She didn't even have to ask a second time. Karen nodded, and resumed walking. The two young slaves were confused, but Cassandra took their hands. "Come with me." But, the master. Don't worry about him." Still fearing the huge dragon, they started walking next to her, chatting about what had happened since the arena. Cassandra detailed her story and then asked them the same. The two young slaves didn't have any good news. The old minister was a cruel man, but his son managed to be even worse. He had taken some of his father's remaining concubines as his own, and chased away or killed the rest. "What a pig," said Cassandra. "Cassie. We'll really be punished if we don't go back," cried Myra. No, don't worry." The more she thought about it, the more Cassandra didn't want to let them go back, or let anyone go back there. She abruptly stopped, and thought about it for a few seconds, before turning to Karen. "Let's go there." He didn't say anything, but she took a deep breath to explain herself. I can't leave them. All the slaves there were like me, they were all my friends. Some are even younger than Myra. His son only inherited his father's wealth and properties, but he doesn't have a title. I can do this, right?" Karen smirked. Of course she could. When would she stop doubting herself so much? Cassandra only seemed to realize her own strength and status when she needed it to help others. "Where is it?" he asked. Cassandra led the way. It was an odd feeling going back to her old master's house. She probably would have been terrified if she hadn't been accompanied by a dragon and its master. One was a killing machine, and the other could eat several grown men in one bite. And both were smitten with her. They arrived a few minutes later. Cassandra took a few seconds at the entrance to calm herself. As she stood there, all of the memories resurfaced, as clear as if it were only yesterday. The yelling, the slaps, and the bite of the whip. All that suffering that had marked her skin forever. She could never get rid of the scars, physical or emotional. The worst thing about it was the hunger though. Most people thought the physical punishments were more painful, but only someone who had lived through it knew that there was nothing worse than hunger. It drove you crazy. She took a deep breath. She wasn't hungry, cold, or scared anymore. Those scars were now just reminders of injuries that had been healed. "Who dares to?" the man yelled, furious. Cassandra had just walked into the room, wearing her red dress, staring at him with disgust. The young man was barely older than her, by a couple of years. He was in his bedroom, wearing just a bathrobe, and two young women by his side. Cassandra talked to them first. "Leave us, please." Her calm and composed tone contrasted strangely with the group of slaves behind her. After some hesitation, the women were about to leave, but their master suddenly grabbed them by the hair, making them both cry out in pain. "Where do you think you're going? You wenches! Who is your master? Let them go." "Why?" he asked. "Why should I obey you, slave? Hey? Where did you steal that dress? Do you think I don't recognize you? You were one of my father's slaves. I'll whip you 100 times for running away." I said, "Let them go." Right after she yelled, a large growl was heard from above. Except for Cassandra, everyone in the room was suddenly terrified, looking up at the roof. What was that?" Too surprised, the young master had let go of one of the women, who ran out of the room screeching. His grip was still tight on the other woman's hair, though, and the woman was quietly weeping, obviously scared. Since it seemed quiet upstairs for a moment, the man, trying to appear more confident, stood up to face Cassandra with a disgusted look painted on his face. "How dare you walk in here and give me orders, you asterisk? You think you can tell me what to do? How about this?" Before Cassandra could do anything, he threw the woman on the floor. He brutally kicked her in the stomach several times. Her screams and the violence of the scene made everyone take a step back, everyone except Cassandra. Despite her own disgust at the man, she suddenly grabbed her shoe and threw it at him. She wasn't aiming to hurt him, but to divert him so he would stop. Her shoe violently hit his temple, making him stumble back away from his victim. The woman was crying loudly, holding her waist in pain. Cassandra walked up to her, checking on her, genuinely worried. She didn't recognize this young woman, but she was also a slave. "Are you okay?" "The master," cried the girl, but her words didn't make any sense. "How dare you injure your master? I'll have you whipped, burned, and killed." Cassandra had enough. Ignoring him, she helped the girl get up. "Where do you think you're?" Just when the man was about to hit them both, Cassandra took one of her hairpins out, and held it like a weapon, aimed right at him. She didn't attack, but with her stance and the speed of his hand, the man impaled himself right on it. Shocked, he saw blood dripping, the needle in the middle of his hand, and took a few seconds to understand what had just happened. Cassandra let go of the hairpin, as he started screaming in pain. "It hurts. It hurts," he kept screeching. Cassandra felt no sympathy for him. After what he had done to so many slaves, for all those years, she didn't have it in her heart to give him any pity. He certainly didn't deserve any. She was about to escort the woman outside, when another loud growl was heard. Understanding it came from above them, half of the slaves present ran out. Cassandra sighed, taking cover on the side. A few seconds later, the room's roof was completely torn away. With its gigantic claws fighting to get rid of the wood, Cray kept eyeing her from the hole just created, impatient. "Cray, stop it! I said to wait." She sighed. Whether it didn't want to listen or didn't understand, the dragon kept digging, making a big mess of what had just been a room seconds before. Cassandra had to sidestep to avoid the falling debris. A few feet away from her, the man had completely forgotten about his pain, staring at the huge black dragon, in utter shock. They. Theer. Third PR. Princes. "His name is Cray," said Cassandra. "And if you move or scream again, you will be his lunch." With that threat, she finally left the room, unharmed, helping the terrorized slave who was clinging to her, mumbling. "The master will kill me. He'll whip me." "Don't worry, he won't do anything to you." Cassandra walked her to the inner court, where the other slaves ran to take care of the young woman, giving her some clothes and checking her injury. Behind Cassandra, Cray noticed she was out, and stepped down to follow her, completely forgetting all about the building it had just destroyed. The slaves were still frightened by the dragon, but watching it happily growl at Cassandra and rub its snout against her arm, was definitely a unique sight. "How many slaves are there?" "About 60, said Ethan. "And about as many servants." Cassandra sighed a bit. She had hoped it'd be less. She was about to turn to walk out and ask for Karen's permission, when she stopped. She remembered his words, right before she walked in here. She should do this on her own this time. No more asking for permission. Taking a deep breath, she turned again, facing the crowd in the outer garden. "I'm on my way to the slave market, to get this thing off my neck. I am an imperial concubine, now. If you want to follow me, I can do the same for you. Where will we go next? Asked one of the middle-aged women. I can offer you jobs, but not to everyone. Some will have to find work on their own. I only need about 20 people to accompany me back to the Onyx Castle. A lot of people were hesitating. It was disheartening to Cassandra, but she easily understood them. Most of these people had spent their whole lives working in this place. In the outside world, they had no idea of what they'd become. Even if it was a different person holding it, they would always fear the whip of another master. Suddenly, someone banged on the door behind her. You wench! You shall die by the chomp! Cassandra turned to look at what the odd sound was. Behind her, Cray froze like a dog caught doing something wrong. The dragon turned its red eyes to the side, obviously to avoid hers. The inert leg hanging out from its maw was a dead giveaway, though. Cray! The black dragon turned its head away, pretending not to hear. Behind her, all the slaves were silently horrified. Did that dragon just? Someone in the group loudly threw up, while Cray was trying to chew slowly, as if Cassandra couldn't see it. There was only one shoe left on the ground. She sighed. She didn't think the dragon would really eat him. Did your dragon eat the master? Innocently asked Myra. We're all dead, whispered one of the men. They won't forgive this. The family. They will kill her and kill us for this. Cassandra turned to him, annoyed. This is an imperial dragon. No one will do anything to you anymore, I promise. You'll just sell us to the next master. What do you care, now that you're one of them? Cassie won't do that, yelled Myra, running to her side. She is our friend. Most of the young people nodded in agreement. To them, Cassandra had been like an older sister, silent and helpful most of the time. Even if she had been gone for months, they remembered her gentleness that no one else had shown them after she had left. Ethan, along with a few young slaves, confidently walked over to her side as well. Nowhere can be worse than here anyway, growled the woman from before, joining them. After that woman spoke, a few others came along. Cassandra knew most of them, but they had barely interacted before. That woman was known as Yazora, one of the slaves that worked in the kitchens. The ones staying behind were all staring at her with defiant looks, either doubtful or scared of the dragon. Cassandra sighed. Fine. We can. Cassandra. She turned around. Karen, impatiently, had arrived inside. As he came to her side, a few people stepped away, too afraid of an imperial family member. Though he didn't wear any purple clothing, they could tell who he was just by the scales left on his skin, his armor, and his behavior. He wrapped his arm around her waist, glancing at the people present. Are you done yet? He asked in a cold voice. Yes, but some cannot leave. Karen stayed silent for a while. His eyes were looking over at the residence, its buildings, and all. He stopped where Cray had made a mess, glaring at his dragon, but the black beast once again looked away. Just keep it, he eventually said. Keep it? You mean this place? Karen nodded. You hate the imperial palace anyway. Is that what he meant for her to keep, this whole residence? Indeed, its last owner had died, but this was way too big for her to keep. She hesitated, looking at the slaves and servants who had all gathered. One of the old maids stepped forward, bowing lowly. "We will take care of it for you, Lady Cassandra. If you can do as promised, we will happily work for you. This residence will welcome you anytime." It was an odd feeling, having her former colleagues be at her service now. Cassandra sighed. She wasn't really happy with this situation, but indeed, it would be much better for them this way. With an imperial family member's protection, they didn't risk anything. No one would dare to raise questions about the place's ownership either. The black dragon that had wrecked some of it would be enough of an explanation. "Are we done now?" asked Karen, visibly bored. Cassandra nodded, feeling a bit better. She wanted to hurry to the slave market. A lot of people were coming with them too. Though it was probably the place she hated the most, it was also where she could hope to find a clue about what had happened to her younger sister. Your Highness." The man couldn't believe his own eyes. A member of the imperial family, in the slave market? What had gotten into him? He glanced at the concubine next to him, and the obvious collar on her neck. What was that? He probably wanted his new toy's collar off, but what was the deal with the dozens of slaves behind him? "Take that thing off." Karen's angry voice had everyone sweating in fear. One of the older men took a step forward, looking at Cassandra's slavery collar with a suspicious look. "It's not that simple, Your Highness. Every slave has a binding contract and a debt to pay in order to buy their freedom back." "A debt?" repeated Cassandra, shocked. "Are you implying I owe you money?" Karen raised an eyebrow, not because of the slave trader, but in surprise at her sudden stance. It wasn't often that he saw her really angry at someone. Cassandra was shocked and furious. She stepped forward, glaring at the man like she never had before. "You stole me like some merchandise from my tribe when I was a child. You ransacked every house, killed every man you couldn't sell. You locked women and girls in cages, like we were animals. If any money has to be taken into account, you owe me more than 100 whole lives could repay, for everything you've done. You owe me everything you took from me, my family, my life, my people." The man was shocked that the young concubine had dared to yell at him. He glanced at the prince, but seeing that he wasn't taking part in the conversation, he crossed his arms and made an offended look. "Young lady, how is it my fault if your tribe, or whatever, fell because of some war or bandits? It's not like people run here for slavery contracts. That's how the business is. We get the slaves and find them places to work. You should consider yourself lucky. You were provided a roof and food after what happened to your people." "Lucky," repeated Cassandra in astonishment. "You think slaves are lucky?" Some of the people following them started yelling at the slave trader, making him step back. The crowd behind him wasn't too happy, either. In the slave market, which was basically a huge tent for buyers and sellers to meet and trade the slaves, there were about 30 to 50 slaves per trader. While their wrists, ankles, and neck were all bound by chains, they were free to glare and yell. Seeing the situation wasn't good, some buyers promptly left. No one wanted to get caught between a slave trader and an imperial concubine wearing a slavery collar, especially when she is backed up by her prince and his dragon. Cray was standing outside of the tent, growling regularly. Plus, with its size, no one could ignore the little mountain of black scales that stood visible behind all of the crowd. "I've spent almost half my life as a slave, and I should be grateful for it," said Cassandra, outraged. "I should be grateful for all the times I've been whipped, beaten, and starved? For eating scraps and drinking dirty water? For risking my life every day? Thank you for the scars and nightmares." The slave trader rolled his eyes, obviously annoyed at her. "What are you complaining about, hey? You got yourself an imperial prince, didn't you? You, of all people, should be grateful you weren't killed." For the first time in her life, Cassandra felt utter hatred for someone. She took the little dagger at her hip, and without warning, slashed the man's arm. Not too deep, just enough for blood to appear, making him yell in pain. You swine! What? Aren't you grateful? Isn't this nothing?" Cassandra yelled back angrily, with tears in her eyes. "Slaves get injuries like this every day. The only person I'm grateful to is my lord, for not killing the abused goods that I am. For taking a liking to me, despite all the scars I carry." "Cassandra, enough," said Karen, taking the dagger from her shaking hand. Gently, he put his hand around her, comforting her and kissing her wet cheek. Cassandra had never been so angry before. She couldn't even express it correctly. Those men are." "Calm down," he whispered. He didn't mind her getting mad at someone. He wouldn't have blinked if she killed him, but he didn't want to see her too worked up, not when she was pregnant. She was crying in anger and shaking. He turned to the man, glaring at him with a deadly look in his black eyes. "The collar. Now." The man hesitated. Even if this concubine was upset or whatever, the prince was a member of the imperial family, someone with money to no end. Maybe he could get some more before freeing that slave for him. "I can do it, but the binding contract, and the fee." This time, Karen had enough. Without warning, Karen grabbed the man by his collar and pulled him back to the entrance. The man screamed like a pig, terrified. He didn't expect the prince would get mad over a slave, or even a concubine. Karen's apparent calm and composure had misled him to think Cassandra was the only one who was angry. "Let me go. I'll free her. I'll free her right away. We have a key. A key that works for..." Before he could end his sentence, Karen threw him like a sack toward Cray. The dragon, like a dog catching a ball, crunched him halfway. It didn't even chew, just gulped the man down, ending his life in seconds. After that, it burped loudly, to everyone's disgust. When Karen walked back to his concubine, Cassandra was frowning. "Can dragons get sick?" she asked. "What would he get sick with?" "Rotten meat," she said with disgust. "It's the second one today." Karen smirked. "His stomach can handle fire." He then turned to the other slave traders present. All of their faces had gone completely white with fear. Before any of them wondered how many humans a dragon could eat in a day, they all ran to Cassandra, each bringing some very odd key. Karen kicked one that had come too close, warning the others not to overstep that range. He grabbed one of the keys and gently turned Cassandra around. Her head was spinning a bit. Really? Now? Was it really happening? She noticed her own breathing was getting louder, her heartbeat ringing in her ears. With a loud clicking, the 2 half rings of metal fell at her feet. Cassandra looked down at the rings for a few seconds, stunned. It was more than just those pieces of metal, it was her neck, and the sensation of lightness, that struck her. There would be no more constant heaviness around her neck, no more pain. She slowly brought her fingers up, touching her skin. It was gone, really gone. It wasn't just the collar that was removed, it was like 100 pounds of sorrow, fear, and pain had been lifted off her shoulders. Cassandra silently started crying, hiding her face in Karen's shoulder. Her prince held her close, caressing her back and neck, waiting for her to calm down. With her cheeks still wet, she suddenly grabbed his face and kissed him without warning. The war god wasn't expecting this. Never before had Cassandra been so passionate, demanding, and commanding. Yet, it felt so incredibly good. He answered her kiss, completely forgetting the world around them. It was like another woman had taken over her body, claiming him, hungry and restless. She caressed his cheek, his nape, keeping him to herself. Karen was pleasantly surprised, his arms around her waist, hugging her until they parted, both of them out of breath. For a while, they stayed silent, their faces close to each other, in a slight daze. "Thank you," whispered Cassandra. Karen didn't answer, only wiping her tears and kissing her gently again, while Cassandra stood against his chest, her eyes closed. She was still trembling a bit, but he continued to hold her and turned to the slave traders. "The others. Now." The slave traders looked at the large group, a bit hesitant, but all of them had seen or heard the sound of a man being eaten alive by a dragon. No one wanted to be the main dish. They rushed toward the other slaves, each carrying one of the keys, and the collars fell one by one. People started crying, screaming, and laughing in joy. Some even hugged their siblings or friends, overwhelmed with relief. Cassandra only listened. She still had her eyes closed, leaning on Karen's chest, her prince's hands holding her tightly. When they were done with the group, the slave traders returned, visibly pissed by what had just happened. Freeing 50 or so slaves in a day wasn't a part of their plans at all. Karen's deadly glare on them wasn't stopping, making them feel as if something was wrong. "Sir, we are done. I said, free the others." For a few seconds, they didn't understand. They had obviously freed all of the group, so why? Then, their faces turned white, one by one. He couldn't possibly mean all of the slaves? Yet, the imperial prince's glare was obvious. The men stepped back. "Your Highness, this is our trading business. This is how we make our living. If we free all our merchandise, we..." Karen's unwavering expression was extremely scary and disturbing. 3 of the slave traders turned back and ran to free their slaves, with shaking hands. The men left were hesitant. He couldn't be serious, could he? All of a sudden, a loud growl was heard. Cray began to bite and tear the tent away. Even though the tent was dozens of meters long and wide, the dragon pulled it like a child would have played with a handkerchief. Karen stayed silent again, but Cassandra stepped closer, talking to the closest traitor. The man who sold me, sold my younger sister too. His name was Nubar. Nubar died years ago, madam. How can I find my sister? She insisted, still visibly upset. The man hesitated, but someone from behind him spoke first. How old was she, madam? She was 7. Then, she was probably sold to a brothel. Cassandra felt her heart sink. To a brothel? I just said she was 7 years old. They take the young girls when they are very young, so they can train them and ensure their virginity. If they are very pretty, they can be sold at very high prices to wealthy nobles, but most of them are kept as prostitutes. Cassandra almost fainted. A brothel. Her sister had really been taken to some brothel? She felt like crying again, and throwing up. Those people were less than human. She turned to Karen, shaking her head, feeling sick. I want to leave, she cried. I want to leave this place. I never want to step foot here, ever again. Karen slowly nodded, and carried her outside, Cassandra's arms around his neck. When he reached Cray, the dragon was growling in the direction of the slave traders, its eyes darkening. Stuff yourself, the war god whispered. Cassandra didn't hear the killing behind them, and she didn't want to. She cried silently against Karen's neck. She couldn't endure any more emotions for the day. She was angry, sad, and exhausted. Her prince carried her without a word, back to the palace. No one dared to bother them. She didn't look up again until they reached the gates. Karen brought her to his apartment and gently placed her on the bed. She wasn't crying anymore, but her eyes were red. He hated seeing her like this. I'll send people to look for your sister. Cassandra sighed. Back then, when I had just been sold to my first master, I looked for her every chance I had. I asked so many people. I was caught and punished several times for venturing outside when I wasn't allowed to. I just wanted to find her so badly. She always looked so much like me, I knew someone would recognize her right away if they saw me. What's her name? Cassandra. Karen nodded, and rubbed her back. We'll find her. She may not be in the capital anymore, it's been so long, cried Cassandra. Before she could add anything else, Karen gently kissed her, and pulled her into the middle of the bed. He kept kissing her, until she finally began to slowly respond to his kiss. Her sister had been lost for almost 10 years. Even if the news that she may have been sold to a brothel was hard, Cassandra still had hope. If she was alive, with the prince's help, they would find her. Right now, there was something important to celebrate. Karen was going down to her jawline, onto her neck, down to her collarbone. Her skin was now all his to touch, caress, and kiss, as much as he wanted. Even on Cassandra's pale skin, one could see the thin tan line from her slavery days. 8 years. For 8 years her neck and shoulders had carried the weight of that heavy, rusted metal. I want to bathe, she suddenly said. Now. Cassandra nodded, and Karen quickly kissed her before leaving the bed, allowing her to sit up. He had gone to give orders to the servants in waiting. After a few minutes, they had her bath ready, lukewarm water with flowers and oils, right in the middle of the room. They dismissed the servants that were waiting with towels in order to be alone. Cassandra undressed, revealing the little belly under her dress. Had gotten a bit fuller and more firm during those last weeks. Karen helped her step inside the bathtub, sitting behind her as she liked. She could finally relax a bit inside the water, with the prince's warm torso against her back. Karen brushed her hair back, kissing her neck and shoulder. "We should celebrate," he whispered. "That I'm no longer a slave. That and this," he said, caressing her tummy. Cassandra nodded, smiling a bit for the first time in a while. She put her hand over his, feeling a lot better just from his touch. "How do you celebrate?" she asked. "Probably a feast." "Gifts. I want to get you something." She chuckled. She would never have guessed the war god was into gifts. So far, all he had given her was gold bars. He was so rich he didn't need to buy anything for himself, as was all of the imperial family. "More dresses?" she asked. "No, a necklace." Cassandra was a bit surprised. "A necklace? What kind of necklace was he thinking about?" "I understand my brothers better now." "What do you mean?" she asked, a bit confused. "You'll see tonight." He was probably talking about the feast. Since they were in the imperial palace, they would probably have to attend. Last time, Cassandra had been there as a slave. Now she was a free woman. That feeling was still too new to her. Despite the weight being taken off her neck, she had yet to get used to not being a slave anymore. Her status had risen considerably in just a few seconds. She was a low-rank concubine, now, which meant she had gone from the lowest status in this country to one of the highest. "Why did you ask your father to take you out of the running as his heir?" she asked, suddenly remembering that issue. Karen glanced at her pregnant belly, his dark eyes bearing a solemn expression. "To protect you, and our son. As long as I can inherit the throne, you'll both be in danger. Constantly. But, it's such an important matter." He sighed, and pulled her closer, pouring water on her back, washing her gently. "I don't care about being an emperor. I don't want you to be scared or unhappy." Cassandra shook her head. "You can't make this kind of decision like that." No wonder the emperor was so unhappy about it. Wasn't he the most favored of the 6 sons? The emperor may act childish when his favorite concubine was around, but Cassandra knew how smart he really was. He wouldn't act that way towards Karen if he wasn't a good heir. Moreover, he was the best dragon tamer. That fact alone spoke volumes about him too. Karen frowned, confused by her reaction. "You don't like that? It's not just about me. There are so many more people than just me in this country. What if whoever becomes the emperor is bad or an incompetent person? Hundreds, or even thousands, of people could die." She gently brushed his hair, looking at him. He was such a powerful and respected man, yet all he could see was her. Cassandra leaned closer to kiss him, enjoying this sweet taste between them. At first, she was so scared of him, but now he was her refuge, the one person she wanted to be with, unconditionally. They kept kissing and caressing each other for a long time in the bath. Karen had a new and embarrassing game, leaving a trail of hickeys from her neck to her chest. When she noticed them in the mirror, Cassandra sighed. "I didn't think you would enjoy my collar being gone to this extent." The prince smirked behind her, putting his pants back on before calling the servants back. A dozen of them ran in to help them prepare for the banquet. Karen only had his scaled braces on and stayed shirtless, as he chased and scared anyone who tried to get close to him. Hence, the servants focused on Cassandra, helping her get ready from head to toe. With her collar gone, it was a whole new attitude they had toward her. They were extremely careful with each movement. They kept bowing and avoiding eye contact until Cassandra begged them to stop. "It's all right, you'll hurt your back or neck if you keep bowing like that." They seemed surprised by her attitude. It was probably very different from the usual concubines. It took a while before they stopped bowing continuously. Yet, they still tried not to look at her directly. If the imperial concubine has a preference, they kept showing her dozens of necklaces, bracelets, earrings, and rings, confusing her. Everything was shining with gold and gems, in all the colors she could think of. How come they had so much jewelry available for her? She had some that she had bought while at the onyx and diamond palaces, but not here. "The emperor has insisted, Your Highness the Third Prince's imperial concubine shall be entitled to own anything she likes." Cassandra was speechless. Now, even the emperor was treating her like a princess. Had the concubine mother played a part in this? Karen didn't seem surprised one bit. He stood up, glancing at the jewelry. "Father is probably trying to calm mother through you. And he's happy about the baby, too." Karen picked a thin gold one, with emeralds, diamonds, and handed it to her. Cassandra chuckled, putting it on with the help of two maiden servants. They helped her put on the rest of the matching jewelry, which included earrings, hairpins, and an ankle bracelet. After picking a very light, off-shoulder dress that had thin layers and a long skirt, the servants put Cassandra's hair up beautifully. Once she was ready, Karen took her out of the room. It would be her first time attending the imperial banquet as an official concubine, as well as meeting the imperial siblings and their concubines. Of course, she was nervous. Half of those people were wishing for her and her baby's death. As she followed Karen, Cassandra had a hard time calming down. Everything would be so different from the first time she had walked into the large hall of the imperial palace. Most importantly, she could hold her head high, and walk beside the prince, instead of behind him. The war god had his arm around her waist as they entered, in a clearly protective stance. "His Highness, Karen the Third Prince, God of War of the Dragon Empire, and his concubine," someone announced loudly. This was very ceremonial, all eyes were clearly on them as they walked in. This time, Cassandra could see all of their faces. First, she realized that the imperial concubine mother wasn't there. Had the emperor failed to convince her to attend? Sherian, however, was sitting in her golden chair next to her brothers. Just like Cassandra remembered, each imperial sibling had their own golden chair. The brothers were a bit bigger than their sisters. All of the concubines, in red and pink dresses, were sitting down below them on the stairs in front of their respective prince. She could guess all the servants were hidden in the shadows behind the golden chairs, but they were completely still and silent. This time, there were no performers, perhaps they had come too early. In any case, Karen took her to his golden chair. She sat right in between his legs, where she could rest her arms and head on his knee. He immediately started stroking her back. She wasn't the only woman touching her prince, another concubine had her back resting on the fifth prince's leg, acting flirtatiously with him. The emperor wasn't there yet, so Cassandra spent time observing the other imperial brothers. She had never noticed how similar yet different they all were. All of them had tan skin and jet black hair. The first prince was the only one with long hair and a very quiet attitude. He wore a large purple tunic and only had 2 concubines. The second prince had his hair very short. He wore a mean expression with his thin features, and he had a total of 6 concubines, with half of them wearing red dresses. The fourth seat was empty, but in front of the fifth, there was a crowd. How many concubines did the fifth prince have? She counted at least 20 in front of the young man, but the women kept chatting and moving, so she lost count. Finally, the brother she knew, Prince Anur, greeted her with a little nod when their eyes met, and Cassandra did the same in return. "So, this is your new woman, brother." Cassandra recognized that woman. Princess Phaedra, who was glaring at her. Didn't she recognize her, though? It didn't seem like she realized Cassandra was the slave she had already insulted a while ago. All of the 10 princesses present were eyeing her, but Princess Phaedra was the only one to speak. Cassandra turned her head to her, staring. She wasn't afraid to look her in the eye anymore. Princess Phaedra wasn't the prettiest, but she had a lot of jewelry to show. She seemed to wait for an answer, but Karen didn't give a star. He kept gently caressing Cassandra's back with his fingers, looking elsewhere with a bored expression. "Such bad taste," she said, clicking her tongue. "Do you have advice to give, sister?" asked the first prince. "Well, one with more curves, to begin with. Aren't you supposed to try and have heirs? How can you do that with such a scrawny woman?" "That's rich, coming from a childless slut," said Sherian, with a smirk. "How dare you?" roared Phaedra, turning red. As usual, Sherian wasn't afraid to bicker with her sibling and turned to her with an obvious satisfied expression. "What? Aren't you the childless one giving advice to a pregnant woman? Oh, Phaedra, really, why weren't you born mute? You're good with your tongue unless it's for talking." For a second, Cassandra wondered if both women were going to have a cat fight. To her surprise, the second prince glared at Princess Phaedra, making her turn red and look down. Did she fear her own brother more than she feared Karen? "The Imperial Dragon Emperor has arrived," suddenly someone announced. All bowed to the Emperor's arrival, though it was quick. He walked to his throne, obviously a bit grumpy, and looked around to see who was there. "Where's this fourth son of mine?" he suddenly asked, staring at the empty chair. "Brother Orpheus is sick, father," said the eldest brother. "Oh, he's always sick of something. Anyway, I'm happy to see you all of you who came here. Sherian, daughter, come here to entertain your father. Bring in the performers." Immediately, a group of dancers appeared at the center of the hall, dancing together to a speedy rhythm. Cassandra didn't feel like watching. She felt like a mouse in a nest of resting snakes. The princes were talking to their concubines, and the princesses between themselves, but you can easily see that none of the siblings really got along. The second prince was whispering to his sister, looking angry. Another sister had also taken part in the conversation. She seemed a bit older than them. Cassandra realized. Anur was still a teenager, but the oldest princess looked to be in her 40s. How old was the emperor, then? She whispered her question to Karen. He is 62 this year. 62 years old? The emperor barely looked 40. How could one look so young at that age, when so many of his children were there? Cassandra was confused. Did that mean the dragon blood made them age slower? She had heard some of the previous emperors had died after 100 years, but she thought it was all just legends. What about you? And your brothers? She asked Karen, now too curious. She had always assumed he was no older than 30, but if the emperor looked like that at over 60, her prince could even be 40-year-old. Sephir is 35, Vrihan is 32, Ophius is 24 or 23, Lephis is 21 and Anur is 15. And I'm 28. Cassandra blushed uncontrollably. So, they had about a 10-year age difference. She had never thought about it. It wasn't uncommon to see an age gap between men and their concubines in this empire, so she wasn't too surprised. The concubine she used to serve was 20 years younger than her master. What are you thinking? He whispered. Cassandra just shook her head and rested it on his knee. She was actually feeling quite safe, sitting so close to him. Karen's hand on her skin chased all of her worries away, even with all the glares she was getting. The glares were not only from the second prince, but from some of the concubines as well. Were those women jealous? It was an odd feeling, but Cassandra pretended not to see them or care. In the main area, Sherian was laughing with the emperor, entertaining her father while chatting with him. It was obvious they had a real bond, even without Karine in the picture. Cassandra. Karen caught her attention as a servant was presenting them with a gold tray of food. Cassandra took a bite carefully, but all the food here was tested for poison. She could remember back when she was supposed to be the one to test it. Suddenly, from across the room, a ruckus was heard. One of the fifth prince's concubines, while shifting her position, had mistakenly spilled some of her wine on one of the young imperial princess' purple dresses. The princess screeched like she was burnt to the 3rd degree. You! How dare you stain my dress? I am so sorry, stuttered the concubine, sounding terrified. Sorry? You're sorry? Look at what you've done! The princess kept yelling furiously. The 5th prince Lephis glanced over briefly, frowning. It's fine, Kayuna. It is just a wine stain. She'll wash it later. It's not fine. I don't want your stupid concubine to stain my dress. Whip her. She should be punished. Everyone had gone silent, conflicted about the situation. It was just a stain, albeit a large one. However, who could say no to an imperial princess? The other concubines were looking down or elsewhere, obviously scared to get involved. Meanwhile, the young princess kept screaming, her tantrum growing louder and louder until it caught the emperor's attention, who simply frowned. "Kayuna, enough," said her brother, visibly starting to get annoyed. "I want that concubine whipped. She'll get whipped 100 times. No, 1,000 times. It is not the same." Cassandra's calm voice from across the room took everyone by surprise. As they looked at her, the war god's concubine was strangely calm and unafraid to answer back. The princess glared at her. "What did you say? If you whip someone 10 times, the skin will be red and sting. If you whip her 100 times, you'll cut into the flesh, and she will bleed. But if you whip her 1,000 times, you'll open the wounds to the bone. There will be no more skin, only exposed, cut flesh, and lots of blood. No one survives after being whipped about 500 or 600 times." Her sudden reality check had everyone silent for a few seconds. Cassandra's cold but serious voice was very different from that of Princess Kayuna's tantrum. She had no idea how to react. With Cassandra's words, it was clear Kayuna had been speaking mindlessly, saying numbers out of anger. The crude depiction of the wound took her back to reality where she was merely toying with someone's life over a wine stain. It was even more striking that Cassandra knew what she was talking about. She was staring right at Princess Kayuna, unafraid and cold as ice. You, said the princess, out of words. But who would dare to respond to a woman who was in the war god's shadow? Kayuna was unsure, and all around her, the room's atmosphere had changed. She looked stupid and childish. "Enough, enough. Sit back, child, and shut up," said the emperor, frowning. "Aren't you too old to act like this in front of your siblings? Hey! Don't ruin our dinner." Princess Kayuna sat, looking down, visibly angry and upset. She didn't dare to glare at Cassandra anymore. Karen hadn't said a word, but the murderous look in his eyes was enough of a warning. "You, child! Come here," suddenly said the emperor. Cassandra was surprised. Was he calling for her? To come to him, now? But he had barely looked at her before. She hesitated, but Karen gently helped her up. The young concubine took a deep breath, and walked to the golden throne, hesitant. Behind him, she could clearly see the two ruby eyes, looking at her in the sea of gold scales. Cassandra barely dared to look at the emperor as she approached. To her, he was a much scarier being than the humongous golden dragon behind him. Yet, the old man gently held his hand out until the concubine placed her hand in his, with a light smile. She could tell there wasn't any animosity in his dark eyes. "There she is," he said softly. "Aren't you as white as a water lily?" "So disgusting," whispered someone from behind her, but the emperor didn't seem to hear it. "What is your name?" "Cassandra, your majesty." "And where are you from, child?" "The Southern Rain tribe, your highness." "I see. That explains a lot then." "Explains a lot?" Cassandra was a bit confused. Next to the emperor, a servant stepped forward, showing them some letters. "What is that?" The emperor didn't look at it, and turned to Cassandra instead. "I received some very interesting letters earlier today, children. From General Haragon from the East Army. Wasn't that one of Karen's generals? Cassandra had never greeted him in person, but she could remember the imposing man wearing armor with a beard. He had spoken with her prince several times. Did he complain to the emperor about a woman being at the camp? Or was there some issue due to the prince's absence? I was curious to hear about how my son's been doing as commander-in-chief, said the emperor. Yet all I read were praises for the young woman he had brought with him. According to 2 of my most trusted generals, along with 7 of their commanders, this empire owes the lives of no less than 200 of its soldiers to a young slave woman. Cassandra was speechless. The generals had written to the emperor about her? She hadn't possibly seen that many men in the Red Room, back at the camp. Maybe 200, but 600 lives. Did they exaggerate on purpose? Or had something happened while she was gone? The emperor went on. According to them, the Lady of the Mountain has been more efficient in healing and teaching her knowledge to their men than any of the useless, stubborn, and whiny military doctors that had been appointed. The injuries and disease reports have been reduced by nearly half. This is due to the men now being able to take care of themselves. Apparently, they insist on thoroughly washing their hands several times a day. She couldn't help but blush and look down after hearing this. She hadn't been to the camp in weeks. How could she have known her little stay had allowed so many things to happen back there? The emperor smirked. It goes on for several pages, with some military matters that would bore most people. The generals are sending their thanks to my 3rd son, for his exceptionally wise taste in women. He nodded in Karen's direction, but everyone knew who was really receiving the praise here. Cassandra was in an inner turmoil. She hadn't expected to be singled out by the emperor in front of the imperial family. When the old man turned to her again, she was still too shaken to react. After reading so much, this old emperor couldn't sit still. Who knew so much knowledge could hide in such a young woman? You make this old man very happy, child. Cassandra had no idea how she was expected to answer, or if she was supposed to answer at all. She wished Karen was by her side, but the prince was sitting still in his golden chair, a few steps away. She was standing by herself in front of the empire's most powerful man. As an emperor, I have to be grateful to the ones who make this empire prosperous, and its people safe. Your knowledge has been helpful to our valued soldiers. I do hope you will lend us more of it from now on. I had thought of a way to thank you, but it seems my son took a step ahead with your situation. Cassandra frowned a bit. He meant her status as a slave, staring at the place where her collar stood just hours prior. The emperor nodded, looking satisfied. Fine, fine. I can just go with my own idea, then. From today on, Cassandra, you will be a noble lady and an imperial physician. Father, yelled Princess Phaedra, her tone sounding more than furious. You can't give a noble title to a slave. Take a good look, sister, this woman is no longer a slave. Sit and shut up, said an older princess. Still. They can't rise from rags to rubies in a day. She's a slave and a southerner. What do we look like if just anyone can achieve that? Not anyone, Phaedra, said the first prince. Lady Cassandra is a skilled doctor, our father's most trusted general attested to that. Can you claim to have any skills as admirable as one that can save lives? With her older brother's glare, Princess Phaedra was defeated. One could tell her anger hadn't subsided one bit. She sat back loudly, glaring Cassandra's way, clenching her fists. The young concubine was too shocked herself to react. A noble lady? Imperial physician? It was all too much for her. Just like Princess Phaedra said, it was unbelievable. All of this was happening to her in just one day. Yet, the Emperor was nodding, satisfied. It is good, very good. I'm counting on you to meet with my own imperial physicians later. You are welcome to study from our imperial library, and I bet those old doctors have a few things to learn from you as well. Yes, Your Majesty. Thank you, mumbled Cassandra. Good, good. And take good care of yourself, too. I want to see this precious grandson of mine as soon as possible. Now you can go and enjoy the feast, young lady. Understanding this meant their conversation was over, Cassandra hurried back to Karen's side. As they reunited, her prince didn't say a thing, he only invited her to gently sit on his knee. Cassandra, feeling a bit embarrassed, refused him, and took back her place in between his legs. No woman was allowed on any of the prince's seats. She had already drawn too much attention to herself tonight. Join our Facebook and WhatsApp group for more updates, link is given in description. Rest audiobook will be continued in next episode.